Part 143. Enacting Justice. The Prophet would shortly forgive the inhabitants of Mecca and grant them amnesty. However, a handful of individuals were singled out as criminals who could not evade punishment. They were Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, Abdullah ibn Qatal, Mikyas ibn Subaba, Al-Huwayrith ibn al-Nukaid, Habar ibn al-Aswad, Abdullah ibn Sa'd ibn Abi Sar, Washi ibn Harb, and Fartana and Seerah. Abdullah ibn Qatal was a Muslim who emigrated to Medina. He was sent by the Prophet on an expedition, but he apostated, killed the companion with him, stole his belongings, and returned to Mecca. He then bought 2 slave girls and ordered them to write poetry insulting the Muslims and the Prophet. At the conquest, he ran towards the Kaaba and grabbed the door, begging for clemency. He cloaked himself with the curtain of the Kaaba, calling on its sanctity for protection. The companions did not know how to navigate this dilemma, so they sent a message back to the Prophet requesting instruction, and the Prophet ordered that he be killed. Fartana and Seerah were the 2 slave girls he hired to propagandize about the Prophet. Fartana was killed, but Seerah managed to flee, later returning and seeking forgiveness, which was granted. Mikyas ibn Subaba also committed a similar act of treason. As explained in the expedition of al-Muraisi, Mikyas pretended to embrace Islam in order to kill a companion, and the Prophet remembered his name at the conquest. Abdullah ibn Sa'd ibn Abi Sar accepted Islam and emigrated to Medina. He was a scribe for the Prophet, but eventually apostated and returned to Mecca, where he began slandering the Prophet and spreading lies about Islam. At the conquest, he sought refuge in Uthman ibn Affan's house, who shared the same foster mother. Eventually, Uthman brought him to the Prophet and sought his forgiveness. The Prophet remained silent, and the companions all waited. The deafening silence continued, growing in tension, until the Prophet finally accepted his plea. After he left, the Prophet turned to the companions and said, "Weren't any of you wise enough to understand? The command was to execute him." One of the companions asked,
"O Messenger of Allah, why didn't you motion with your eyes?"
The Prophet replied, "It is not befitting for a prophet of Allah to order a killing by motioning with his eyes." Allah therefore willed that Abdullah ibn Sa'd ibn Abi Sar survive, and through his decree his status in Islam grew, living a righteous life and eventually becoming the governor of Egypt. When Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl lost the skirmish at the conquest, he quickly fled, taking a ship to Abyssinia. En route to Abyssinia, a fierce storm overwhelmed the ship, and they all resigned themselves to their inevitable deaths. The captain remarked,
"Now is the time to make dua to Allah, for by Allah we all know that our other gods cannot help us now."
They miraculously survived, and Ikrimah recalled,
"It suddenly struck me that if our gods cannot help us when we need them most, why should we worship them when we don't need them?"
After 2 decades of opposition, Ikrimah internalized the truth of monotheism. He said,
"O Allah, if you save me, I will accept Islam, and I will go to your messenger and put my hand in his, and I will find him to be forgiving and merciful."
He then traveled right back to Mecca and concealed himself, traversing through the crowds until he stood in front of the Prophet, unveiled himself, and quickly declared,
"I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that you are the messenger of Allah."
Ikrimah lived the remainder of his life as a Muslim, eventually dying as a martyr fighting the Romans. Habar ibn al-Aswad caused the miscarriage of the grandson of the Prophet when he caused Zainab to fall off her camel. Zainab was attempting to emigrate, and Habar attacked her camel, causing her to fall and lose her baby. Al-Huwayrith ibn al-Nukaid similarly caused 2 of the Prophet's daughters harm as they tried to emigrate, threatening them and causing them to fall off their horse. Al-Huwayrith was killed, but Habar somehow managed to negotiate his forgiveness. Washi ibn Harb, the final name on the list, famously killed Hamza, as already explained in detail. He fled to Taif and eventually accepted Islam when the people of Taif converted. Of all the people in Mecca, only 9 people were on the kill list, and of those people, only 4 were eventually executed. The conquest of Mecca occurred because the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was violated when the Banu Bakr, with the assistance of the Quraysh, attacked the Banu Khuzā. The Prophet therefore allowed the Banu Khuzā to attack the Banu Bakr by way of Kisa'as. However, the Prophet instructed that they must end their attack and quash their rivalry at Asr, which was a few short hours away. After the Asr prayer, the Prophet strictly forbade all forms of fighting, and the sanctity of the Haram returned to its default position. The following day, a member of the Banu Khuzā killed someone from the Banu Bakr, to which the Prophet grew extremely angry. He gave a fiery sermon condemning anyone who violates the sanctity of Mecca, threatening that the families of those killed will be allowed to enact Qisas on anyone who spills blood. The Prophet said, "The Haram has returned to its sanctity the way that Allah created it. And if anyone tells you that the Prophet fought and shed blood in it, then say to them, Allah allowed the Prophet, and he did not allow you, and Allah only allowed him for a brief hour in the day." Mecca remained sacred, and thus no war booty was taken, and no land was seized.